Hello, everyone. This is the 104th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview English podcaster Mr. Jeremy Davies as we discuss the ups and downs of Nottingham Forest in the decade of the 1990s. Mr. Davies is on the Nottingham Forest related podcast 1865, the hashtag NFFC, hashtag Premier League podcast. Welcome, Jeremy. Good to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to talk about a very eventful decade, and good to look back now that Forest are back, at least temporarily, well, hopefully permanently, where they belong.
Can you introduce yourself and your history with football?
Sure. Well, I, like many people in the UK or in England, certainly, really got into football around the time of the 1990 World Cup, when I was sort of looking for something to take the place of Transformers in my imagination, basically. So I always say that Gary Lineker replaced Optimus Prime in my personal pantheon. But I asked my dad if he supported a particular club, and he went to university in the Midlands, in Loughborough, which is a city in England not far from, well, in the East Midlands, not far from Nottingham. And he was there in the mid 60s when Forest were reasonably strong, competing for the League and Cup double in one particular season, 65, 66. Sorry, 66, 67. And he introduced me to the team. I always wanted to be a left back. And of course, at the time, Forest had at left back Stuart Pearce, who was England's captain, the best left back in the country. And so it was a very natural, it seemed like a very good fit for me, for many reasons. So I became a Forest supporter. And it was serendipitously that season, not unrelated to the fact that Pearce had a real point to prove after missing his penalty for England in the World Cup semi-final. Forest reached the FA Cup final, had a brilliant cup run that was televised on the BBC, and I went to the final with my dad, which was a brilliant experience. Quite a sad outcome, but an amazing day.
So, before we get into the decade of the 1990s, can you describe the state of the affairs with Nottingham Forest in the 80s, following the league and European Cup triumphs of the end of the previous decades and the beginning of the new decade, and going into the end of the 1980s?
Yeah, well, it all went slightly haywire in the early 80s. First of all, Forest were on the wrong end of a very controversial and subsequently proven to be corrupt referee in a UEFA Cup semi-final against Anderlecht, I believe, in the early 80s, which saw kind of the end of their European adventures. The famous team that won the European Cup was broken up too early, as it turned out, and certainly Clough in later years would reflect that they tried to change things and make too many changes too early. Then there was a very significant falling out between Brian Clough and Peter Taylor, who'd been his assistant and a crucial part of the success that he had over. Taylor went to Derby County to try his hand at being number one, and then subsequently signed John Robertson, who is widely regarded as the greatest player in Forest's history, and that caused a falling out, from which they never recovered. So a lot happened, and then in the late 80s, Peter Taylor very tragically died. Clough and Taylor hadn't spoken since the falling out, and that really affected Brian Clough, who was already having problems with alcohol, and it really set him, I believe, on a downward spiral from which he didn't recover. On the flip side, the team, after a kind of hiatus in the mid 80s, re-emerged in the late 80s with Pierce, Des Walker, Nigel Clough, Brian's son at the core, Neil Webb, and various others. Won a couple of cups, his first trophies since the European Cup. They won the League Cup 2 years running in 89 and 90. And as the 90s began, we're in a pretty good place as a club. Neil Webb had left, gone to Manchester United, but there was a good young team. I remember purchasing a VHS, it was that long ago, in the wake of the 91 Cup final, narrated by John Motson, who was a very famous BBC commentator. And his closing line, the video ended with the Cup final defeat in 91. And his closing remarks were, for this young team, there would be lots of tomorrows, which just underlines the optimism and the bright future that was seen at the time with the team that Forest had. And yeah, it's poignant in many ways.
Yes. And as you mentioned, Brian Clough, you can't discuss Nottingham Forest without mentioning him, who was a larger than life figure, in a way bigger than the club. What was his position at the club at this point in the new decade?
He was the club. As to quote Roy Keane, Clough was Nottingham Forest. He ran it from top to bottom. Everyone was in awe of him. So he was very firmly established, and certainly there was no inkling that he was in failing health, that he was winding down. There was a lot of talk in the wake of the Cup final in 91 about the fact that he had stayed on the bench at the start of extra time, hadn't addressed the players, various other idiosyncrasies, which he was very widely renowned for. Certainly in the 91-92 season, which was the last season of the old Football League before the foundation of the Premier League, I remember reading lots of matchday programs in which opposition managers would sing his praises. He was still much in demand as a talking head by the broadcasters, and the team was very highly regarded. So the events that were to unfold in the first season of the Premier League, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about, were certainly not anticipated by anyone, as far as I'm aware.
Yes, you're right, because as the decade of the 1990s started, Nottingham Forest were in a relatively stable position, fluctuating within the eighth and ninth positions. And like you mentioned, they had won the League Cup 2 years running. In the spring of 1990, they defeated Oldham. And by all accounts, there was a feeling that this type of stability would continue.
Yeah, I remember reading in the paper a pre-season tournament at the start of 92-93, which is the first season of the Premier League, and it described Forest as a kind of antidepressant because they were playing, I forget who was in the tournament, there were a couple of other English teams that were very direct, route one long ball, which was what was seen as the English, well, to use a term that was bandied about in another respect, the English disease, which was how hooliganism was often referred to at the time. But it was also very much seen as the malaise of English football was down to this, obsession with long balls, the ball in the air, the big striker winning knockdowns, which Forest were not about because they were very much a passing team. As Clough famously said, if God had meant us to play football in the clouds, he'd put grass there. So, yeah, it was, you had England's captain, you had a core of relatively young players that were internationals. You had Roy Keane, who was just missed out on the Young Player of the Year award a couple of years running, but was widely seen as the new Brian Robson. And obviously, as it turned out, that was very fitting because he ended up in the Manchester United midfield.
Now, when did you yourself start going to the matches at City Ground?
Well, my first match, funnily enough, was the 91 FA Cup final at Wembley, which was, as I said, an amazing day. And I subsequently started going on and off to games at City Ground with my dad. We lived in just outside London, so it was not something we were able to regularly do. But I think my first match was in the FA Cup again the following season against Hereford. Forest won 2-0. Stuart Pearce scored again, having put away a free kick in the cup final. Teddy Sheringham, who was a key figure, if a short-lived one, but still a key figure in the story of what happened, what transpired at Forest in the 90s. He also scored. So yeah, 1991, 1992 was when I first started attending matches in person.
So let's look at the first season of the decade at the old First Division, the 1990-91 season. And let's look at the transfers and the squad at hand and your memories. So as far as transfers, we have Roy Keane coming over from Co-op Ramblers. And I imagine it was a very under the radar transfer at this point. And
Absolutely.
yeah, you have Lee Glover from Leicester and Mark Smith from Stoke City. As far as departures, you have Franz Carr leaves in February. He joins West Ham. The Icelandic Thorvaldur Orliksson, I believe he's loaned to Fram Reykjavik. So not too many transfers. As far as the squad at hand, you still have Mark Crossley, the Welsh goalkeeper in goal. You have Gary Charles, Steve Chettle, Brian Laws, obviously Stuart Pearce, the captain of the team, along with Des Walker, Gary Crosby, Scott Gemmell, another Scottish player, Steve Hodge, England international, Gary Parker, Ian Vaughan, and Nigel Clough, the number nine, as he's called by his father, also Nigel Jamson. So good, decent side. You would think they would finish in the eighth place in the first division. And as you mentioned, they would reach the FA Cup final on May 18th, but lose to Tottenham 2-1.
That's correct. Yeah, and it was a Des Walker own goal, which was such a by a very strange and unfortunate, unhappy coincidence, almost identical to the own goal he scored in the playoff semi-final in 2003, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about a bit later on. The squad, the team was strong, inconsistent, and they got off to a really slow start. I was watching the season review back the other day, and I think significantly when Frank Clark took over in '93, one of the first things he did was bring in a new fitness coach because he remarked the team weren't fit enough. Training, as Pearce describes in his autobiography, was very unstructured, pretty much do some sprints and then play five-a-side, which was a very 1970s, 1980s way of doing things. And it was just on the cusp of that greater, not professionalization, the game was obviously already professional, but greater, much more scientific approach to training and preparation coming in. So it was already looking particularly dated, and that probably is one of the reasons behind the regular slow starts that the club got off to, and as they built up their fitness over the early weeks of the season. Another factor was that they tended to go on, as again recounted in Pearce's book and various others, they tended to go on kind of money spinning pre-season tours to far-flung corners of Europe and beyond, which obviously sapped the energy as well. So yeah, it was an inconsistent start. Obviously, memories dominated by the cup run. I mean, the one notable result of that early season was an early game, I think fifth or sixth game of the season at Old Trafford, Manchester United, and Pearce was getting abuse from the crowd who were shouting, "Pearce is a German, Pearce is a German," in reference to the World Cup semi-final, and that missed penalty, and he went on to score an amazing free kick. I think they ended up winning 2-0. But the cup final was a remarkable story, featured a lot of replays, which is something that are no longer with us, but it made for brilliant compelling television. Obviously, the standout find of the season was Roy Keane, and was a key figure in the cup run, from famous occasion in the third round, I think, when he played a poor back pass, which led to Crystal Palace getting an equaliser, a late equaliser at the City Ground, and Clough subsequently floored him with a punch and said, never do that again. And then he went on to score in the quarterfinal, I think, and the semi-final. And yeah, and just to emphasize the point about fitness and how the team would become stronger over the course of the season, that few weeks prior to the cup final, there was a 7-0 win over Chelsea at the City Ground. And then the following week, they won 5-0 against Norwich, which was incredible stuff. And then I think they drew with Tottenham, which was seen as a rehearsal for the cup final, and it all was looking pretty sunny and optimistic in the build up to that day at Wembley.
Speaking of Keane, was it self-evident at this point that he would become the personality that he became?
He was very highly regarded. It was at Wembley, he got the biggest cheer when the teams were read out, which surprised me because I was expecting it to be Stuart Pearce, but Keane was the name that, had the cheers echoing from the rafters. Certainly, he was very highly regarded. And subsequently, I've done some reading. He made his debut against Liverpool and put in some really hefty challenges on John Barnes. In an early season game against Tottenham, he was marking Paul Gascoigne, fresh from the World Cup and his success, and blossoming into this, figure of international renown, and did a really good marking job on him. Apparently, his first game at Old Trafford, to quote Sir Alex Ferguson, he absolutely creamed Brian Robson. And apparently that was that point Ferguson decided, we have to get this guy to Manchester United. So, yeah, I think by people in the know and by supporters and the public, he certainly caught the eye. I think, as with anything in football, it's, you can't, there's no such thing as a cast iron production. Interestingly, he was on the shortlist for Young Player of the Year, PFA Young Player of the Year that season, and the player that won it was Lee Sharp. And the following season, I think he was one of the runners up to Ryan Giggs. So yeah, in answer to your question, yes, he was. I don't think anyone could have predicted that he would have become what he became.
It has been reported over the years that had Nottingham Forest won the 1991 FA Cup, Brian Clough would have retired there and then. Do you feel that would have brought the change necessary to stabilize the side, or his presence or absence would not have changed the trajectory of the subsequent events?
I've thought about this a lot. It's so difficult when you have a figure that is that all conquering, all important, all consuming at a club. I mean, the nearest parallel, the most obvious parallel is what happened to Manchester United after Sir Alex Ferguson retired. But I do think, if you consider, there was no way they were ever going to hold on to Roy Keane. And I don't think you could have stopped Des Walker joining Sampdoria. But yeah, I think if, for example, Frank Clark had come in a bit earlier and worked with the existing squad to help them get to higher levels of fitness, then you might have staved off what subsequently happened. I mean, there were huge issues beyond Brian Clough's control. Walker leaving, Pearce's injury, which robbed them of him for almost the entirety of that first Premier League season. But he fell out with Pearce over a contractual issue, which could and should have been avoided, and probably, if his judgment hadn't been askew, it would have been avoided. And the team was left weakened in key areas, which, again, certainly if he'd had his, if it had been on top form and vintage judgment, he wouldn't have allowed to happen. So, yeah, I think on reflection, it probably would, because the squad and the team were pretty strong, certainly in the year before the Premier League, 91-92. And, if they had stronger leadership, if they had better conditioning, and if they'd been prepared better, I think because the club is not of the size and the financial clout of a Manchester United, a Tottenham Hotspur, in that brave new world of the Premier League, they probably wouldn't have continued to punch at the weight that they had previously. But I'd like to think that with a different manager in place, there would have been more stability. On the other hand, Clough has never publicly said that he would have retired. It's been speculated that he should have retired, but I can't say with any certainty that was what he would have done. And he certainly was and would have been a very tough act to follow. So it's a tricky one. It was a combination of factors, the vast majority of which for which he was culpable, but there were circumstances beyond his control as well.
Now, let's look at the last season of the old First Division, the 1991-92 season. As far as transfer activity, we have Teddy Sheringham arriving from Millwall, the Northern Ireland international Kingsley Black arriving from Luton, and the Icelandic Thorvaldur Orliksson coming back from his loan from Fram Reykjavik. As far as players leaving, Nigel Jameson joins Sheffield Wednesday, Lee Glover joins Luton, England international Steve Hodge joins Leeds United and will win the league title with them. Scottish player Brian Rice joins Falkirk. Gary Parker in November, he'll join Aston Villa. And in the new year of 92, Phil Gilchrist will join Middlesbrough. As far as the league standing is just like the previous season, Nottingham Forest ends in the 8th position. They reached the FA Cup quarterfinals. They reached the League Cup final and they will lose to Manchester United 1-0.
The loss of Jameson was a significant error of judgment. According to Stuart Pearce's book, Clough thought Jameson was a big head and therefore left him out of the cup final squad in 91, which was a huge mistake, and kind of promoted Lee Glover above him. Johnson went to Sheffield Wednesday and subsequently didn't do an awful lot, which was a real shame because he looked a brilliant play for Forest. He'd scored in one of the League Cup final wins, scored quite a few in 1990-91, including a hat-trick in the FA Cup. 6th round, I think, 5th round. That was a significant loss. Steve Hodge also went to Leeds, and he was a very handy squad player who'd kind of been elbowed out of the way by Keane's emergence. The same goes for Gary Parker, who was replaced, I think, by Scott Gemmell. And the loss of those two would come back to bite, even though, Keane was undoubtedly a superior replacement. Once injuries began to bite and he had to move back into defence at a certain point, there just wasn't the kind of strength in depth to compensate for the loss of those players. Gary Parker went to Villa and did really well with them. But the season over was, again, it was inconsistent. Forest would beat the league leaders one week and then lose to, no offence to them, Luton Town the following. Luton, who went on to get relegated, or Sheffield United, who were also near the bottom. So it was a very inconsistent up and down season. The League Cup final, as you say, they lost. They had an amazing semi-final, 2-legged semi-final against Tottenham. Keane scored the winner in the second leg with a header. And significantly, so Alex Ferguson, he was then, was on the ITV punditry team in the studio and was raving about him, which again was a mark of the future, if only we known it at the time. They also reached the final of the Full Members Cup, which was then known as the Zenith Data Systems Cup. 1-3-2, I think, against Southampton. Scott Gemmell scored twice, but Stuart Pearce got injured, which was a significant blow, kept him out of the League Cup final, which they lost, as you say, and was also a significant blow to England in that he came back for the European Championships that summer, but not looking quite the player he had been. So it was a bittersweet season. Lots of good memories, lots of nice football. Standout moment for me, apart from my first matches at the City Ground, was a televised live match on ITV against Arsenal, who were the league champions, and Forest won that beat Arsenal 3-2. Could have been more. Teddy Sheringham scored with a diving header. Ian Womes got a great left foot shot. And I think Scott Gemmell got a goal too. And that was a marker, an indication of how good Forest could be. But be it down to injuries, lack of strength in depth, lack of fitness, they just didn't have the wherewithal to put together a really consistent run of form. But certainly going into the dawn of the Premier League, with the exception of Des Walker's departure, things were looking pretty good.
So let's look at this critical first season of the Premier League, 1992-93 season, and the start of the troubles. As far as transfers, Gary Bannister was signed from Oxford. Scottish midfielder Ray McKinnon arrived from Dundee United. As the form dipped, Neil Webb rejoined Nottingham Forest in October from Manchester United. And in March 1993, when everything looked doomed, Robert Rosario arrived from Coventry without any much desired effect. The critical transfers were that of Des Walker, who joined Italian side Sampdoria. We also have to mention Tommy Gaynor, the Irish forward. He joined Millwall as well. But one that really signaled all the troubles was the departure of Teddy Sheringham. I believe, was it after the very first match against Liverpool, the one the televised match? Then
Two
that he
games
joined
in.
Tottenham. Yeah. So he was still with Nottingham early in the season, and then he left to join Tottenham. Forest would finish dead last. In most previous seasons, we mentioned they were always in the top 10 and had satisfactory cup runs. But somehow the transfers of Walker and Sheringham completely destroyed the team. How critical of players were they that this happened to a stable team?
Well, the other significant loss was Stuart Pearce, who had been crucial to the club and to the team, and as I said, was injured and fell out with Brian Clough as well. So that was a massive destabilizing factor. I've read that the departure of Des Walker meant that Pearce, fit or not, could no longer join the attack as much because he would overlap all the time and scored so many goals and set up so many goals. And because he knew that Des Walker would be able to fill in for him at the back because he was so quick. And the famous chant was, "You'll never beat Des Walker." So that was a huge blow. They brought in, I think the defensive pairing for that season was Steve Chettle, who was a great loyal servant to the club, and Carl Tyler, who'd been signed from
Barnsley, I believe.
Would now be a championship team. It was highly regarded, but obviously wasn't Des Walker. On the opening day of the Premier League, the first ever televised match on Sky, obviously they won 1-0 against Liverpool. Teddy Sheringham scored a great goal. Now, it's often described as Clough's final error to sell Sheringham, but if you read Clough in his own words in his book Walking on Water, he refutes that absolutely, because he says you can't keep a player who's not happy, and Sheringham had left London, had split up with his then girlfriend, and was only able to see his little boy Charlie alternate weekends and was unhappy. And Clough made the point, and he was always very, very strong advocate for players with stable relationships and families. That is not a good, he wasn't in a good place mentally, and therefore one could argue that, yeah, having been at the club for a year, having moved from London, it seemed a strange move on Sheringham's part, if he was, that devoted to living in London. So, yeah, the story behind that whole saga of Sheringham's time at Forest is one that I'd love to know more about. But the real critical error was failing to replace him. As you said, Gary Bannister came in as a replacement and wasn't in the same class. I mean, Sheringham had been at Millwall, so it wasn't as if he was the figure he subsequently became. This kind of, very cerebral, clever forward who was the perfect foil for Alan Shearer and played in World Cups and brilliantly in European Championships. So signing a Championship stroke second division, as he was then, player to replace him might have been seen as, it's worked once, why can't it work again? And Forest were notable for doing that, for finding players in lower leagues. And look at Roy Keane as an example, finding players that had been overlooked or gone under the radar. But yeah, it just didn't work out. Yeah, they were both very significant, but you can't discount the problems with Pearce, both the injury and the dispute with the club.
So this relegation forced the retirement of Brian Clough in 1993. Now, how was he still viewed by the Forest faithful at this point? Because it always seemed like he always retained the support of the fans.
Absolutely. I remember reading letters in magazines at the time. There was a magazine called 90 Minutes, which was just on the crest of the emergence of a new breed of more sophisticated, for want of a better word, football magazines. And I remember a letter in that from a Forest supporter saying, "I can't believe we're still being so loyal to Brian Clough, the man who got us relegated." But that was very much a minority view. It's really interesting to look at the parallels with Steve Cooper, who's the current Forest manager, and through all the problems he had last season and is currently experiencing a pretty bumpy time, he's retained the loyalty of the fans. So I don't know if it is unique to Forest, but I think a club that has been inconsistently elite in its history and a bit of a yo-yo team outside of certain key periods, any manager that brings that level of success is going to be venerated. And Clough was such a big figure. I mean, you mustn't. It's hard to get one's head around the fact that he's occasionally compared to Jose Mourinho as a real box office figure. He was that big a celebrity, that big a personality. So I think, yeah, he certainly did retain. I mean, the day the team was relegated at home to Sheffield United at the end of the 92-93 season, it's famous that all corners of the ground, including the Sheffield United fans, were singing Clough's name, and it was widely regarded as an almost Shakespearean tragedy what had become of him. So, yeah, he certainly maintained the support of the fans, who kept believing until it was no longer possible to believe.
Now, looking objectively as a Forest fan, do you think he may have made mistakes in the last years of his management, or were the circumstances just beyond him at this point?
Oh no, absolutely, he made mistakes, and he's very candid about them. You could point to the dispute with Stuart Pearce, the failure to keep up with modern conditioning methods or any kind of tactical. I mean, it wasn't that he wasn't tactically sophisticated, certainly in his younger days, but he had no time for the sort of, science, pseudoscience, as he might have seen it, that was emerging. Selling Sheringham and failing to replace him adequately was an error. As I've said, the sale of Steve Hodge, Gary Parker, Nigel Jepson, and their replacement with substandard quality alternatives. There were a lot of errors of judgment, and his leadership was obviously becoming, his management was obviously becoming more and more erratic, as sadly the horrible disease of alcoholism took hold and his health deteriorated. On the other hand, as I've said, the dawn of the Premier League era was changing the game, literally. Sky's strapline was, it's a whole new ball game, and I don't think Nottingham Forest were ever going to maintain that level of excellence in an era that was so dominated by money. The sale of Walker was a huge loss, and again, that was beyond his control. Sheringham's failure to settle, well, arguably blame on both sides, and the injury to Pearce, notwithstanding the dispute that he got into, was also not of his making. And if that hadn't happened and he'd remained, the player he had been throughout that subsequent season, when Forest got into trouble, who knows? He really was that good.
Frank Clark had been a successful player at the club. I imagine his appointment satisfied the fans.
Yes and no. The popular choice at the time was Martin O'Neill, I think, who was doing great things with Wycombe Wanderers, and had been. Sorry, I don't mean to chuckle over the name Wycombe. I grew up in Wycombe, so Wycombe Wanderers was my second team for a time. But he was doing great things with them, and I think subsequently went to Norwich before he ended up at Leicester, where obviously he would become very successful. But he was, the name Trevor Francis was also mentioned, who had just taken over at Sheffield Wednesday and was doing well with them. So Frank Clark was at the time sort of earmarked by Clough, who said, I've long thought he should be my successor. So I think that certainly went down well with the fans, as, again, to draw the parallel with Manchester United, when Moyes took over, he was seen as the chosen one. But I think it was because Frank Clark hadn't actually been managing. He was president, I think, of Leyton Orient rather than a manager. So there was some uncertainty about what it might actually look like, how it might work out, because he didn't have a recent track record to compare with that of, say, Martin O'Neill. But obviously he did, retain a lot of affection among the fans because of his previous achievements with the club.
Let's look at this season in the first division in 1993-94, where Forest earned promotion with Clark at the helm and Stan Collymore as a star of the team. So obviously relegation meant that there would be a clear out of the players. So the main one, Roy Keane, joined Manchester United. Others like Gary Bannister and Orlickson, they joined Stoke City. Gary Crosby joined Grimsby Town. Ray McKinnon joined Aberdeen later in the season. As far as the arrivals, we have Des Little in defense coming from Swansea, Colin Cooper coming from Millwall, Stan Collymore, who's unknown at this point, coming from Southend United. Later in the season, we have Norwegian internationals Lars Bohinen coming from Lillestrøm. And in the new year, we have Alf Ing Halland, father of you-know-who, coming from Brine. As well as later on in the March, we have Jason Lee also coming from Southend United. So there's a massive turnover, as you would expect with a team being relegated.
One other very significant departure, Nigel Clough, who also.
Oh, yes, of course,
joined Liverpool.
Yeah, joined Liverpool, of course, yeah.
Yeah, and got off to an amazing start there. Inherited the Liverpool number 7 shirt, which was obviously legendary, having been the shirt of Keegan Dalglish and Beardsley and got off to a brilliant start before Robbie Fowler's emergence. The mention of Alfie Inge Haaland, who had several very famous moments, not always to his benefit in the subsequent years. I had a very cruel line on a podcast, on a Guardian podcast recently, which was mentioning Alfie's much more famous son, as we all know, with Man City, saying his mother must have been really good at football, which was a very cruel reflection on. Alfie Haaland was a midfielder stroke defender who had his own qualities.
Nottingham Forest finished just behind Crystal Palace, but were promoted for the 1994-95 season. So this 1994-95 season would be surprisingly a successful season, and I'm sure not many people would have expected a third place finish and subsequently UEFA Cup qualification. This was a season where Stan Collymore would take the Premier League by storm and was earmarked as a future star, etc. As far as the transfers, this is the post-World Cup era, World Cup 94 era, and the Dutch winger, Brian Roy, arrived from Italian side Foggia. I imagine he must have caught the eye of Forest management from following the World Cup. For all intents and purposes, Brian Roy was the main signing that season. But you have players like Gary Crosby joining Huddersfield Town, and Lee Glover joining Portwell, and Brian Laws leaving and joining Grimsby Town. With this new team, Pure Steel in defense and Colin Cooper, Chettle, we have Welsh midfielder David Phillips, Lars Bohinen, Stan Collymore, Steve Stone catching the eye that season, and others like Jason Lee. Surprisingly, this team finished third. At this point, many people, I imagine, must have thought the relegation 93 must have been a fluke and Forest are in their rightful place and perhaps ignored the institutional problems.
Yeah, well, the story behind Brian Roy's transfer is recounted in Frank Clark's book. He was obviously aware of Roy because we'd all seen him on the telly playing for Holland, the Netherlands, in 1992 and subsequently in the World Cup in 94. And Frank Clark had gone out to look for a player, and an agent tipped him off that Roy might be available. And initially, Clark was very disbelieving, didn't think that they'd be able to achieve that. Apparently, Roy's wife was unsure about moving to Nottingham, and there's a story that Clark pretended, or someone involved in the negotiation pretended that Nottingham was a lot closer to London than it actually is. But anyway, he joined the club, and actually, you say winger, which is what he was renowned for being, but he was moved to the centre to partner Collymore in a strike partnership. Scored on his debut against Ipswich, I think. And then, but what really served notice that this was going to be a season to remember was the first Monday night game of the season live on Sky was Manchester United at the City Ground. Forest drew 1-1. Collymore scored a great goal. Roy Keane was booed from first whistle to last, which is slightly unfair. But it was clear that the team was going to be a force to be reckoned with. David Phillips, his arrival, was very significant. That came fairly early in the promotion season when Forest were not looking good, frankly. They hadn't got off to a great start. Collymore had been injured, but Phillips was a key component of that team. And I remember a defeat in that first season against Blackburn, and Frank Clark saying that Blackburn's most significant factor in their win had been neutralising David Phillips because he was the hub of the midfield of the team. So, yeah, certainly it looked like everything was fine. Forest were back, and everyone was very optimistic. The issues were chiefly around Collymore, who was unique as a forward, as a player. There was no one like him. He had a lot of fallings out with his teammates famously punched Alfie Inge Holland on a pre-season or on an away trip, regularly fell out with the manager, would disappear off to his home in Cannock, just outside Birmingham, which wasn't a long way away, but would go missing. There was a spell during the season when players refused to celebrate with him after he'd scored, which wasn't great, obviously. And then he went to Liverpool at the end of the season. But again, my personal highlight was going to White Hart Lane and seeing Forest beating Tottenham, who just signed Jurgen Klinsmann 4-1. And Lars Bohinen was a brilliant midfielder, scoring an outrageous chip towards the end of the game to make it 4-1. Collymore, funnily enough, didn't score that day, but he did set up a goal for Steve Stone, who, as you mentioned, had really come to prominence, and subsequently 2 goals for Brian Roy. So it all looked very, very good going into Europe, albeit we had hanging over the prospect of losing Collymore and the somewhat impossible task of finding someone to fill his boots.
Yes, so let's look at this 1995-96 season and the first season back in Europe, the first time since the Heysel ban. So obviously, Collymor's loss was a heavy one. He was transferred to Liverpool at the time. It was a record or close to a record, if I'm not mistaken,
It
for a
was
British.
a record £8.5 million.
Right. In October, Bohinen would leave to join Blackburn Rovers and Carl Tyler would join Aston Villa. As far as the arrivals, we have the first Italian from the Serie A, Andrea Silenzi from Torino. And the recently deceased Chris Bart Williams arrived from Sheffield Wednesday. This season would be back to norm as Forest would finish in the 9th position. In the UEFA Cup, they eliminated Malmo, French sides Auxerre and Lyon, but were heavily defeated by Bayern Munich in the quarterfinals. It couldn't reach the heights of the previous season, but at least Forest looked like a stable side regardless.
Yeah, well, they actually set a new record for consecutive games unbeaten early in the season. It was a carried over from the previous season, but it was, I think they'd broken their own record, which had been set under Clough by the Miracle Men in the late 70s. And I remember match of the day on the day that they achieved that, Alan Hansen, who was very famous ex-Liverpool defender and a brilliant pundit who subsequently became, unfortunately, most famous for the famous phrase, "You'll never win anything with kids," which in fact he did utter that season in reference to Manchester United, who subsequently go on to do the League and Cup double. But he said, 45 games unbeaten or however many it was is an amazing achievement, but that team will not win the Premier League. And ultimately proved to be correct. I don't know if you mentioned Kevin Campbell, actually, who was another
Oh no, I
significant
didn't.
arrival.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, yeah. Sorry.
He was the replacement for Collymore, who was, great player, a very good player, subsequently be very important in the promotion year in 97, 98, but he wasn't Stan Collymore. But then nobody else was. I mean, I think you could perhaps have put Les Ferdinand in a similar bracket for his, in terms of someone that could just pick the ball up and run past 5 or 6 defenders. But, Collymore was compared not entirely fancifully to the Brazilian Ronaldo. He was that unique. So they were never going to be able to find a ready-made replacement. The season had lots of high points. Europe, obviously, they got they were the only team to reach the quarterfinals of any European competition, the only British team to reach the quarterfinals of any European competition. They did so by defending like hell, as Pearce would describe it, and nicking a goal, which they did. Ian Wone, who had been spurred into life by the arrival of Brian Roy, had a great season, scored some really memorable goals, including one at Newcastle that cost them the league title. You mentioned them losing heavily to Bayern Munich, but actually they had the first leg in the Olympic Stadium in Munich, where they'd won the first European Cup. They lost 2-1. But Steve Chettle scored a goal at the same end in the same goal. Trevor Francis had scored the winner in the 79 European Cup final. So it wasn't as if they looked out of place, certainly in that game. But then, unfortunately, in the Nottingham match, they were just caught on the break. They started really well, actually, made a lot of chances, couldn't finish them off. Jason Lee, fine player, fine man, does a lot of work now supporting footballers in the arena of mental health, but wasn't Stan Collymore, and they ended up losing 5-1, I think, and Jurgen Klinsmann filled his boots, and Jean Pierre Papin was up front for Munich as well. So, but it was a season that again had its highlights. I went to again White Hart Lane with my friend who's a Tottenham fan. Who must, I mean, you'd think the penny would have dropped and he'd have stopped taking me to matches. But we went to see an FA Cup quarter-final, I think. No, FA Cup fifth round at White Hart Lane when Forest won on penalties. And Mark Crossley, who had matured from a somewhat error-prone 21-year-old in that first year of the 90s into a very, dependable keeper, saved penalties from Teddy Sheringham, I think. And yeah, certainly going into the following season, it all looked pretty stable. And you would have thought, as you say, that Forest had re-established themselves as a mid-table, if inconsistent, staple of the Premier League.
So now we come to the 1996-97 season and the second.
Do we have to?
So we have to mention that this was the first season of the Bosman era. And I imagine a team like Forest were unable to financially compete in this new world, so to speak. They would finish dead last again and only win 6 matches that season. Now, as far as transfers, the Croatian defender Nikola Yerkan arrived from Real Oviedo. Welsh striker Dean Saunders arrived from Galatasaray. When the damage was already done later in the season, Nigel Clough returned from Manchester City. Although it was on a loan, he would return, I guess, in March the following year. In March, Dutch striker Pierre van Hooijdonk was signed from Celtic Glasgow as a last-ditch effort, but it was for nothing, as at this point they were already doomed. The likes of Jason Lee also left the club in February 97. He joined Charlton. And Italian striker Andrea Silenzi was also offloaded in the beginning of the season. He's often referenced as one of the biggest flops in the Premier League era. But I guess the historical aspect of him was that he was the first Italian and Serie A player in the English Premier League.
Yeah, Andrea Silenzi, who was, to the great traditions of Italian strikers, what pineapple on pizza is to the great traditions of Italian cuisine. He just didn't work out. He was, a big burly striker, which was why he was seen as a good fit, a better fit for an English team than possibly an Italian one, which is why, I mean, obviously the pizza thing is, pineapple on pizza thing is a joke, but it is actually a joke with a serious point in that, he was seen as an English type player. But again, he wasn't Stan Collymore. Actually, the first day of that season was a 3-1 win against Coventry. Kevin Campbell scored a hat-trick, including an amazing third goal, which I don't think anyone would have associated with him when he juggled the ball over a defender's head. And, things were, I think they then drew with Middlesbrough, who were mentioning the Bosman era and the Bosman ruling and, the Premier League's newfound wealth. Middlesbrough were at the time, featuring Harlem Globetrotters style Juninho, Emerson, Fabrizio Ravanelli, another Italian striker who possibly didn't work out quite as might have English fans might have hoped, but it was a good start, and things were looking okay. But Steve Stone broke his leg, I think, got a serious injury anyway. And I remember reading at the time in a newspaper coverage the following day, Forest's game revolves around Stone. And I don't think anybody gave him the credit that he deserved, at least that year, the less perceptive among us, because he didn't look like a glamorous winger. Because he was short and bald. He looked like a ball-winning holding midfielder, but actually, it was true. It was like taking Ryan Giggs out of Manchester United. It really was. He was the creative driving force, particularly with Pierce's declining fitness and powers. And that was a hammer blow. So yeah, the season went on. Frank Clark famously said, "I'm not going to stay here like a turkey waiting for Christmas," and resigned. Pierce took over as player manager, and his first game, he apparently forgot to pick a goalkeeper when he was laying out the team the previous night. But his wife spotted the error and corrected him. So we ended up, his first game was home to Arsenal. Forest won 2-1, 2 goals from Alfinger Haaland. And it looked for a while like it might be the shot in the arm that the club needed. Pierce himself, I think, scored from a free kick against Sheffield Wednesday as they won there. But then Dave Bassett came in to work with him, and it just fizzled out. It was a real shame. Van Hooijdonk, actually, from what I saw, and I wasn't able to get to many games that I did. My friend, the Tottenham fan, Richard, we went to see Forest play Spurs at the City Ground, and Brian Roy scored twice again, and Forest won. So I think that was the last time we went to a match together. I think he must have learned his lesson after that. But it was a season that had it very few high points, but everything just seemed to be fizzling out. Van Hooijdonk fleetingly seemed to kind of revive Brian Roy, who suddenly had a Collymore type partner to belong. I remember he did some good things in those last few games of the season, but they kept drawing matches, and yeah, it was sad. And obviously, at the end of that season, Pierce finally, having stayed with us the first time we went down, because he was trying desperately to get into the squad for the '98 World Cup, left the club, joined Newcastle, which was a huge wrench for everyone involved. But as far as I recall, the majority of the squad remained. Like the previous relegation, we maintained a stable of experienced top level international players. So yes, went into the championship season in pretty good health.
Yeah, so let's look at the second season in the championship, 1997-98. Another immediate promotion with Dave Bassett in charge. This time, Nottingham Forest finished first to come back directly to the Premier League. As far as the arrivals, we have the infamous Jeff Thomas arriving from Wolves, and everyone remembers his miss against France in 1992. Marco Pascolo, a Swiss goalkeeper, arriving from Cagliari. We have Andy Johnson coming from Norwich. We have a Norwegian defender, Jon Olav Hijeld, arriving from Rosenborg. French midfielder Thierry Bonalaire coming from a Swiss side, Neuchâtel Xamax. Dave Besant, also as a goalkeeper, arrived from Southampton. And I guess that's the Bassett connection. Later on the season, Glyn Hodges arrived from Hull City. As far as the departures, Brian Roy left to join Hertha Berlin in Germany. You mentioned Stuart Pearce joined Newcastle. Nikolai Yerkan joined Austrian side Rapid Vienna. Alf Ing Haaland joined Leeds United. Mark Crossley joined Millwall. David Phillips in November, he joined Huddersfield Town. And later in December, Dean Saunders joined Sheffield United. After two promotions and two relegations in a few seasons, I imagine the fans are not as optimistic at this point.
Well, you have to remember that quality of the team, the players who remained. You had Chris Bart-Williams, we had Kevin Campbell, we had Van Hooijdonk, and that season, and we had Colin Cooper, who must be forgotten, was tremendous that season and had been the eventual replacement, albeit very different type of player, to Des Walker. In he became the mainstay of the defence for that 2 or 3 year period. And I think the mood was one probably of cautious optimism. Holding on to Van Hooijdonk was massive in that, he was clearly a class, occasionally world class striker, and that was what we had not had. The fact that he hadn't scored many in his brief tenure in the Premier League was a concern, but we everyone could see how good he was. So I think that the concern was tempered with optimism, if I can put it that way. We knew that we had the potential to compete, and a manager in Dave Bassett who knew how to get a team promoted.
So let's look at this 1998-99 season back in the Premier League, but also the third and the most critical relegation. Now, this season was also marred by Pierre Van Hooijdonk's one-man strike in the beginning of the season that set the pace for the events that would follow. Now, as far as transfers, we have Nicolas Yerkan returning from Rapid Vienna. We have French forward Jean-Claude Darcheville coming on loan from French club Stade Rennes. Nigel Kouachi arriving from Queen's Park Rangers. We have Andy Gray coming from Leeds. We have another French player, defender, Matthew Louis-Jean, arriving from Le Havre. Neil Shipperley, striker, coming from Crystal Palace. Later in the season, we have Swedish defender Jesper Mattsson arriving from Halmstad. We have another Norwegian defender coming on loan, Stal Stensas, coming from Rangers Glasgow. And French striker Bernard Alou also comes from the J League, from the Nagoya Grampus 8. And in January, even Carlton Palmer arrives from Southampton, as does a Portuguese striker Porfirio on loan from Benfica. We also have, at some point, Richard Gough also arrives. Yeah, as far as the departures, Marco Pascolo joins the Swiss side, FC Zurich. Colin Cooper joins Middlesbrough. Kevin Campbell joins the Turkish league at Trabzonspor. Well, this was a key loss, as we would see when he joined Everton before the transfer deadline, I should say. A lot of comings and goings, and at some point, even American John Harkes arrives in the team. That's when Ron Atkinson was manager at this point. So a lot of comings and goings in an unstable season. Speaking of Richard Gough, he arrived on loan from the United States from San Jose Clash, and John Harkes arrived from DC United. The one thing that sums up Nottingham Forest season is on February 6th at home, they lose 8-1 to Manchester United, the treble-winning Manchester United side.
I just watched the highlights today just to punish myself. It was York and Cole, Dwight York and Andy Cole scored twice each, and then Ole Gunnar Solskjaer came on as a substitute in the second half and scored 4. It was doomed from the start. Van Hooijdonk, as with the Stuart Pearce dispute in 92-93, just destabilised the entire club. What happened was that Kevin Campbell was sold without the consent or knowledge of Dave Bassett, the manager. Van Hooijdonk went on strike in protest. When he was eventually persuaded to return, he spoke about offering an olive branch, and Dave Bassett famously responded, "He can stick it." And then, again, in an echo of the Collymore situation a few years earlier, people refused to celebrate with Van Hooijdonk when he scored. And, if they weren't going to rally around him, it was never going to work out. There just wasn't the strength in depth. They couldn't score. They didn't have, Jean-Claude Davies, a tragic story that he lost his wife and children in a car crash just a year previously, for obvious reasons. Perhaps wasn't feeling well, didn't have everything psychologically in the right place. He didn't work out. Marlon Harewood emerged during that season, but was inconsistently able to find the target. It was, Dave Bassett left. Ron Atkinson came in and famously went to sit in the away dugout on his first game at the City Ground, which didn't go down well, but just summed everything up. I don't want to scapegoat Carlton Palmer. He was obviously not responsible for the relegation, and I don't want to denigrate him because he had his qualities. But, that the signing of Carlton Palmer kind of symbolises everything that had changed, because under Clough, Forest were associated with signing these neat and tidy, skillful ball players, and Carlton Palmer's arrival, demonstrated how things had changed, because he's very much associated with a certain era of the England team when they were not playing successful, stylish, or effective football. And, like I said, I don't want to denigrate him because he's a professional footballer and I'm not. But he wasn't a traditional Forest signing. And of the 3 relegation seasons, it was easily the most depressing, if I can put it that way. None of them are particularly red letter years, but the one that had the least grounds for optimism, I guess.
Now, unless you're part of the Forest faithful, chances are you've lost track of the club's fortunes, other than knowing that they had fallen off significantly from their previous status. Can you summarize these last couple of decades?
The best way to sum up those couple of decades are a chant, "You're not famous anymore," which was often heard, not just by Forest, but by any team that plummeted down the division. Certainly, Sheffield Wednesday, Manchester City, would you believe, in the 90s fell into League One, or Division 3, as it might have once been known. And that chant was would be aimed at their supporters by some of the opposing fans they were coming up against. After their relegation in 99, the club brought in David Platt, who was actually regarded in retrospect as just being ahead of his time in his training methods, but he tried to bring in a European, Italian style method of coaching, which took time to adapt to. And by the first couple of seasons, Forest finished sort of mid-table, lower to mid-table championship, whatever it was called at that point. But subsequently, players such as Alan Rodgers and Chris Williams have said it was taking us time to adapt, but I felt that we were getting there by his 3rd season. But then he left to manage England under 21s. At that point, the club were in real financial difficulties and appointed Paul Hart, who was a former player who had to sell the entire squad to stave off bankruptcy, but then brought in a selection of players from the youth team who got to reach the playoff semi-finals in 2003, lost in the semi-finals very unfortunately to Sheffield United in a game that is etched into the memories of all Forest supporters for all the wrong reasons. Des Walker, who's back at the club, scored an own goal, almost identical to the one he scored in the cup final. But that team, with the likes of Michael Dawson, Andy Reid, I think Jermaine Genius had left by then, but Marlon Harewood, a lot of players that would go on to achieve fame and fortune, and in some cases international recognition and success with other clubs. That was the chance, and that was the one that got away. And after that, things got progressively worse. The club went through, a decade and a half of chronic instability. They couldn't keep a manager for more than a season, and they went down. They came back up again. They sort of scrapped at the bottom of the championship for a few seasons. Then eventually brought in Sabri Lamouchi, who very nearly achieved promotion with the team. At one point was looking good even for automatic promotion, let alone the playoffs. But then the pandemic intervened, and Forest missed out on the playoffs with the last kick of the last game of that lockdown season when everything was played behind closed doors. Lamouchi then the club went on a bad run. Lamouchi left, and then worked through a couple more managers who didn't work out until eventually they appointed Steve Cooper with the club bottom of the championship and looking, at further hard times. And 3 years on, with 2 years, we're still, we're still dreaming. So, yeah, it's been, as I mentioned earlier, in comparison with a club like Oldham or Cardiff or Swansea, one of those teams that, like Icarus, soared too close to the sun. It's been a story with, and I'm touching wood here and keeping my fingers and toes and everything else physically possible crossed, a story with a happy ending. And who knows where we'll be, a year from now. But certainly, yeah, it was a tough couple of decades to take as a Forest supporter. And yeah, you're not famous anymore is probably the best way of summarizing what it's been like.
Now, looking in hindsight, can you pinpoint a reason or reasons that was the reference point when Forest's trouble started?
We're not unique in that, in the wake of the Premier League bubble bursting, actually, the Premier League bubble has never burst, it's just gone on expanding, but the English Football League bubble bursting. In the early 2000s, ITV Digital had signed a massively lucrative deal to broadcast the Premier League and the Football League, and subsequently that fell apart. Forest, like a number of clubs, had overinvested. I mean, Leeds, Sheffield Wednesday are equal examples of this sort of reaching for the skies and falling to earth. But that was the overstretching the finances, not being of a size of the likes of Manchester United to be able to sell enough tickets, to sell enough merch, to attract the kind of sponsorships, to keep that kind of financial clout. There have been some many other misfortunes. The tragic death of Nigel Doughty, the owner, that playoff semi-final in 2003, which should have been, the revival of the club. But I think, I would say if I had to choose one moment, it would have been, and I hate to say this because he's a legend, but that own goal by Des Walker against Sheffield United that knocked Forest out of the playoffs. I think there was a goal disallowed, or at least maybe somebody hit the post in that game, and that was the start of the decline because it just sapped the spirit from the club. And then, Dawson left, Reid left, the team was broken up, and it was all downhill from there until, as I said, the emergence of Steve Cooper.
After the third relegation in 1999, we have to remember that Forest had immediately bounced back on the first attempt in the two previous times. What was it different this time where Forest stagnated for decades?
Well, as I said, they brought in David Platt, who had new ideas, and there wasn't sufficient ability to adapt to those new standards. As I said, a lot of his players have subsequently said, we thought we were really getting there. We thought we were really onto something by his third year because we'd all caught up with his methods. I think it was Alan Rodgers, who was the left back that replaced Pearce at the club, recounted that he'd used heart monitors for the first time, which is something he brought with him from Italy, and he would stop the players running when their hearts got to a certain level, whereas previously the rule had been you keep running till you're sick. So it was that kind of that much more scientific approach to coaching and to playing and to management, which just was very much at odds with what England had been used to. So that was. Plus, also you have to remember that when Forest were relegated in 2000 in '93, they had Stuart Pearce and they had Stan Collymore and other international players. When they were relegated in '97, they had Pierre Van Hooydonk, Kevin Campbell, Steve Stone. And they just were, they didn't have that caliber of players when they went down for the final time.
From Clough's replacements in the decade, it seems like Frank Clark was the one who perhaps should have stayed longer. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that Frank Clark was lucky in a way, in that he unearthed Stan Collymore. Now, Stan Collymore, as you mentioned earlier, he was not unknown. He'd scored some really good goals for Southend in the FA Cup, which had been broadcast widely on TV. So there was an awareness of him, and certainly his manager, Southend, was a very famous English manager called Barry Fry, who again is a notorious media figure with a big reputation. But unearthing him was key, absolutely key, as was holding on to Pearce, to subsequent success. There's no way Forest would have come up without Collymore, and certainly no way they would have achieved what they went on to achieve in that first year. So what you have to remember about Clark, though, is he was not a young manager, and subsequently when he joined Manchester City, he didn't achieve the same kind of success with them. And I think at that time, the game was moving on, things were changing, new standards were coming in. I think, again, if you go back to the players that have said they thought David Platt, success was coming under David Platt. I mean, Brian Clough wasn't an immediate success. It wasn't an overnight success at Forest. Managers don't get that time anymore to establish success. So yeah, I think that certainly the Frank Clark era we look back on with huge fondness. But there was serendipity. I mean, there's always luck. Any good manager is a lucky manager, as Alex Ferguson would no doubt attest. But yeah, I would have liked it. It was him. He jumped before he was pushed, and that was, there were circumstances beyond his control, notably with the Steve Stone injury problem. I would certainly have liked him to have stayed for a couple more years, and perhaps, might have groomed Stuart Pearce as his eventual successor, rather than him being thrust into the player management role before he was ready to take it up. So yeah, that might have established sort of a dynastic style, similar to what we once saw at Liverpool.
In closing, how do most Forest fans living in those days look back at the roller coaster decade? Is Forest's plight a reflection, a cautionary tale of the money required for small teams to keep their heads above water?
It's a tricky one. I think that if you look at the broad sweep of English football over the past 2 decades, the first one you go to as a kind of cautionary tale would be Leeds United, because of what happened to them, betting the farm on getting the Champions League. I'd say that the watchword or the key word, the key moral of the Forest story is stability. You need stability at a football club, because that's the thing that defines Nottingham Forest over the past couple of decades is instability. It's not lack of finance. You've had wealthy owners. We had Nigel Doughty, who pumped millions into the club before his tragic death. You had Fawaz, the Fawaz family, that ran the club for a time. But you had this revolving door approach to management, which, and we had managers that had been successful at other clubs, Mark Warburton, Chris Hughton, Gary Megson, Sabri Lamouchi, Ita Karanga, that just weren't able to deliver for Forest because of the consistent inconsistency and the lack of stability at the club. And that, the kind of managers were never seemed to be given more than a year. That is partially down to it's reflected right across, certainly across the Premier League, but the rise of social media and the football phone-in and all of that. So suddenly managers have a much shorter shelf life, because the demands of and the grumbles and complaints of fans and the amount of financial risk that's tied up in football necessitates a far shorter term, more short term decision making process, which mitigates against stability. But if you look, and I keep coming back to this, if you look at the club's decision to back Steve Cooper last season, whilst he was facing calls for his dismissal, and famously the club had just lost 4-0 to Leicester when he was given a new contract, and that was seen as the key moment in keeping Forest up last season in Forest survival. So yeah, I would say the moral is the importance of stability, not so much the importance of cash. I think you have to look elsewhere for a real cautionary tale of the perils of over investment.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. You may contact me on my blog and on Facebook. I'm under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on Twitter at 1888 letter, and his blog is the 1888 letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify, on Google and Apple Podcasts, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. And Mr. Davies' contact info is also listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Jeremy, thank you once again for this in-depth discussion. May not have been a very happy discussion for you, but I appreciate all your
It is.
insight.
It has been a bittersweet discussion, but it was a bittersweet decade. So, and it's appropriate given given that the conversation began with talking about Forest playing Tottenham in the cup final that we're speaking a few days before Forest play Tottenham in the Premier League on Friday night at the City Ground. So fingers crossed for a positive result, a better result than on that day at Wembley. So thank you for having me. I hope that I've provided enough illumination to cast light on what has been a cautionary tale of the perils of overambition and perhaps unrealistic expectation in football.
Well, thank you.